we are now ready to start talking about wisdom, the wisdom of Proverbs, and the Logos of John. So let me take these last 10 minutes and just more or less read almost without stopping, because I want to get through this part of my commentary. It was never really meant to be this long. It just ended up being that way because I'm long-winded. And yes, I admit I am long-winded. So let's read through this part. And I think it's self-explanatory if I will just stop stopping and interjecting. So we're working our way towards the book of John, chapter 1, which I do have to at least show you this part, right? John 1:1, in case those of you who aren't in the know. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. This is NASB, but it reads almost identical in almost every version. And we've got the Greek reproduced, which many of us have memorized. In arche ein ha logos, kai ha logos, ein proston theon, kai theos ein ha logos. And this word which was in the beginning, and which was with God, and which was God, and in verse 2 again stated that he was in the beginning with God. Verse 3 says all things came into being through him, and apart from him nothing came into being that has come into being. So we've got a little bit of agency language going on, that God used this word to create all of the rest of the known universe. And yet at the same time, John says that this word was with God and was God, meaning he was fully deity, he was fully divine. I may as well read verse 2 and 3 in the Greek as well, since I read verse 1. Hutos ein in arche proston theon, verse 2. And then verse 3 says, Panta di autu, egeneto kai chorus autu, egeneto ude en hen ha gegonen. And that'll be just those brief passages in Greek from John. All right, let's turn over to my commentary and read down through some of this, and I'll try to read without stopping. Okay, you ready? Here we go. This is not available, by the way, anywhere online. I did that by design. It's so that you would be invited and encouraged to follow the YouTube teaching here, which is the only place where you're going to find this little essay that I put together sometime earlier last year. Proverbs 8:23 is a verse that has been the subject of much debate and discussion in the history of theology. These are my own words. While there are different interpretations of this verse, the Trinitarian understanding of Proverbs 8:23 has been the dominant view among Orthodox Christians. Again, these are my own perspectives as an Orthodox Trinitarian believer. I go on to say that in this second half of my essay, we will examine the strengths of the Trinitarian understanding and the weaknesses of the Unitarian understanding of Proverbs 8:23, as seen through the lens of its parallels to the Logos of John, with a special emphasis on both the original Hebrew of Proverbs as well as its translation into Greek in the Septuagint. So we're going to work our way towards the Greek in the Septuagint, which is why I'm not kind of reading a lot of it right now. Let's keep going. The verse as rendered from the NASB reads, quote, "From eternity I was established from the beginning, from the earliest times of the earth," end quote. Now I go on to say that there's really no reason why the verse could not be translated somewhat woodenly as, quote, "From eternity I was poured out, from the beginning, from the earliest times of the earth." Notice I use the verb now, poured out. The REV Bible, which is a translation favored by www.biblicalunitarian.com, translates the verse as, "From antiquity I was woven together, from the start, from the earlier times of the earth." And then I go on to say that comparatively, this verse is translated as follows in the ESV, which we quoted from the Biblical Unitarian, I believe, maybe earlier. "I was set up from everlasting," or maybe it was NIV, right? "I was set up from everlasting, from the beginning, before the earth was." So we're looking at this verb, and we're basically trying to ascertain, along with verse 22, 23, 24, 25, some verbs are used. There's about 3 verbs in those 4 verses. What is the poetry being conveyed to us? Why is it that a variety of verbs are used, and which ones are the best ones for us to walk away with. Let's talk about some parallels with John's Logos, right? We're going to look at some of the Hebrew as well. Proverbs 8:23, when examined through a Trinitarian lens, offers intriguing parallels to the personhood of wisdom as depicted in the Gospel of John. These are my own notes again, particularly in John 1 through 18. And I already read the first few verses of John 1 for you. The original Hebrew rendering of Proverbs 8:23 states this, and I read this earlier, but I'll read it again. Me'olam nisachti merosh mikadme aretz. Now, let's pick on this word nisachti, which is the word translated set up in the many of the English translations. All right, so these are my own words again. The Hebrew term nasachti, used in Proverbs 8:23 and most often rendered as formed, appointed, or established, installed, quite literally means poured out or set up. It's used metaphorically to describe the establishment of wisdom by God before the creation of the world. The word nasach, right, which is the root word of nisachti, is also used in other places in the Old Testament to refer to the pouring out of a drink offering or the setting up of a memorial. So remember, in verse 22, we have a word that could be just translated as brought forth in one version, or created if we're using the Greek, especially if we look at the New Testament, where that same word is used to describe God as creating the world. So we've got some strong ties to creation there, that verb, but at the same time, being brought forth is tied back to the Psalm passage I mentioned very earlier in my study, Psalm 2, verse 7, I believe, where the God speaking about his firstborn, right? You are my firstborn, today I have begotten thee. That word begotten in the Hebrew and the Greek is this idea of birthing language. This idea of begetting is God giving birth, or the Father giving birth to the Son, metaphorically. Well, this is tied into the poetry of the passage as it shows up and the words that are used in the book of Proverbs here. Remember, this all belongs to poetic genre, so we need to allow the force of differing words being brought into the discussion to have their say, and we can't really make our decision based on one word. We don't want to cherry pick. At the end, we want to make sure that we're drawing from the wide gamut that's portrayed by the words before we make our final decision, by the variety of words. I go on to say that in Proverbs 8:22, the word nasach emphasizes the divine origin of wisdom, which was poured out or set up by God before the creation of the world. Remember, in the biblical worldview, in the Hebraic mindset, there are two kind of chambers that are separated by a vertical line that I'm going to draw for you in your mind, but it's going to show up in screen and post-production. This vertical line is baby blue in my little graphics that's going to show up. And it separates these two realities or chambers or spheres of existence. On the left side, we have the sphere of creator. And under that label creator in all bold letters on the left side of the chart that you're going to see in post-production, we have God. God is creator. We have the Father, we have the Son, we have the Holy Spirit. And they're all God, they're all creator, and they rightfully belong on this left side because they belong to a sphere known as eternity. A sphere that is outside of and wholly preceding everything else that is on the other side, which is creation, or which represents everything else. And so in the biblical worldview, there's created and there's creator. There's the creature on one side and there's a creator on the other side. There's God and eternity on one side, and there's everything else on the other side, which is finite. There's infinite and there's finite. There's eternity and there's non-eternity, right? So that's why we can place Nasach and wisdom on the God side, because using other passages that give us fill out the rest of the picture, then we can see that the word was described in John as being with God, as well as being fully deity, fully divine, fully with God. All that God was, the word was, if we translate the Greek kind of rather woodenly. Let's keep reading down through my commentary. Didn't mean to do that. We've got about maybe a minute left, and let me see. Can I finish Wow, there's no way I can finish this, but we'll keep reading. We can finish at least one more paragraph. I go on to say that the meaning of the word nasach has been a topic of debate, right? Rightly so, among scholars. Some scholars argue that the word should be translated as, quote, created, end quote, rather than poured out, quote unquote, or set up, quote unquote. And this interpretation emphasizes, when we're talking about created, it emphasizes the idea that wisdom was created by God before the creation of the world, right? We're talking about more along the lines of the Arian / Jehovah's Witnesses perspective about wisdom being something that God lacked, but he had to create, and yet they're in a dilemma, like we looked at earlier, because God cannot be all-wise and self-sufficient and immutable if he had to create a major aspect of his personhood, right? Wisdom, right? Other scholars, I go on to say, argue that the word should, so we're talking about nasach, should be translated as possessed, quote unquote, rather than poured out, quote unquote, or set up. This interpretation emphasizes the idea that wisdom is a possession of God rather than a separate entity. Okay, so we're looking at some of the nuances of this word that in the end we're talking about a poetic form of describing God creating the world using a tool or an agent that's described and called wisdom that in the end is feminine, right? A sister in the earlier passage, or a woman in this passage in question. Let me read at least one more here. I go on to say that despite the differences in interpretation, the word nasach emphasizes the divine origin of wisdom, which was established by God before the creation of the world. So what I do is, no matter if you're going to say it was something created by God, which I don't think is exactly the best way, or you're going to say poured out, because that has its roots in the drink offerings that we looked at earlier, right? That's a rendering of the word nasach, and it's just describing the action that is initiated when God uses this tool of wisdom to result in what we would now call the creation. Thus, nasach, in that aspect of being the tool that God uses to pour out creation, whether he created the tool prior to creation or whether the tool was already in his possession, which I vote for. I go for the fact that it's an eternal tool, an eternal aspect that God had, meaning God has always been all wise. God has never lacked wisdom. I go with that aspect. In other words, if I had to take the side of the Socinian / Jehovah's Witnesses, the Arian / Jehovah's Witnesses, or the Socinian / Unitarian positions, I would go with the biblical Unitarians in this regard to say that wisdom was not created by God like the Jehovah's Witnesses would have to say. Wisdom is eternal. And that's the aspect or the nuance of this word that I'm going with. It emphasizes the eternal aspect because wisdom was there prior to the creation. And in the biblical worldview, creation is it's one category in and of itself. You can't have three categories where one category is eternal, that's God. A second category is creation, that's everything else. And yet there's this middle category, which is partly outside of creation, but partly outside of eternity, kind of stuck in the middle there. All right, although Yeshua is quite unique, and we could probably fit him in there if we wanted to say that he's fully God and fully man, truly God, truly man, quite unique in all of creation. When it comes to the incarnation, this emphasizes, I go on to say, the eternal and divine nature of wisdom, which existed when? Before the creation of the world. So I'm going to keep repeating that. The word nasach is consistent with the Trinitarian understanding of Proverbs 8:23, which, are you ready for it? Just one view, which views the wisdom of God mentioned in this verse as referring to the second person of the Trinity, which is the Son. So this is one perspective we're working our way towards. It's not the only Trinitarian perspective, but I go on to say in closing in this part, and then we'll close the commentary down tonight. According to this view, the Son is begotten from eternity by the Father. Remember our Psalm 2 verse 7 passage. He's begotten from eternity by the Father and is therefore co-eternal and co-equal with the Father. He is not a created being. He is co-equal. He exists alongside the Father in eternity past, and yet as the Son, as the person of God, as the person of the Son, consubstantial with God, the same substance that God is made up of, if we want to call it that. Therefore, there's no reason to downgrade his status to that of creature like the Arian/Jehovah's Witnesses do, nor to downgrade his status as mere human like the biblical Unitarians/Socinians do. No, we elevate him to full God status, full divinity, like John does in John 1:1. John 1:1, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And that'll do it for a Trinitarian response to biblical Unitarianism.